The Pacific, June 1942. A stage so vast that even entire fleets look like toys scattered across a blue infinity. On one side, the rising sun burns with supreme arrogance. Japanese carriers slice through the swells like palaces adrift, their decks polished, their commanders certain they are untouchable. To Tokyo, the Pacific War is a chess match they are destined to win. Every piece gleams, every move rehearsed. Closer now, the smell of hot fuel and lacquered wood clings to the air. Japanese pilots sip tea, laugh, and sneer at the notion of American resistance. To them, the Zero fighter is divine, and the enemy's aircraft are little more than barnyard relics. One plane in particular, the ungainly, outdated SBD Dauntless, is the butt of their jokes. Slow, heavy, as graceful as a brick falling from the sky. But war is a cruel judge. And sometimes, the weapon you mock is the one that buries you. Step aboard the USS Enterprise. The deck thrums underfoot, alive with clattering boots and shouted orders. Young American pilots, boys who just months earlier were stuck in classrooms or gas stations, tighten their harnesses, wipe sweat from trembling hands, and prepare to climb into what even their own commanders sometimes called obsolete. Their odds, grim. Their mission, unthinkable. To dive headlong at the heart of the strongest navy on Earth. What the Japanese failed to grasp is that the Dauntless' very flaws concealed its brilliance. That falling brick could plunge with terrifying accuracy, delivering a single 1,000-pound verdict straight onto the deck of a carrier. It did not need beauty. It did not need speed. It only needed a moment, a sliver of opportunity carved by fate and courage. And fate, on June 4, 1942, was merciless. Within hours, the proud carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the pride of Japan, would burn, their crews cast into the sea. An entire fleet gutted not by battleships, not by futuristic jets, but by the very dive bombers dismissed as worthless. This is not just a story of machines colliding on an ocean stage. It is a tale of arrogance, timing, and the brutal poetry of underestimation. How a weapon the Japanese laughed at became the knife that severed their empire's ambitions. And if you think history is a dull march of dates and names, think again. Here, you will taste the smoke, feel the cockpit shudder, and hear the silence that follows when giants fall. Subscribe, stay with us, and witness how the Dauntless, mocked, doubted, forgotten, rewrote the fate of the Pacific. In the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire believed it was untouchable. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins, Singapore had fallen, and the rising sun stretched from Burma to the edges of Alaska. Newspapers in Tokyo spoke of a new age, where Japan would dominate the Pacific for 1,000 years. And at the center of this empire's pride were its aircraft carriers, the sharpest edge of its blade. The Imperial Japanese Navy viewed itself as the aristocracy of war. Its admirals quoted Bushido while sipping whiskey, convinced that their pilots, disciplined, deadly, and schooled in perfection, were unmatched. Their Zeros had humiliated every opponent. Their torpedo bombers had danced through American defenses with contemptuous ease. To them, the war was not a question of if victory would come, but when. And yet, hidden within this confidence was a fatal blind spot. The Japanese saw themselves as innovators, but secretly clung to tradition. They believed speed and elegance defined modern warplanes. To them, the Dauntless, a squat, rugged, almost ugly dive bomber, was an embarrassment. Slow, noisy, and lacking glamour, it seemed more like a flying anvil than a weapon of precision. One Japanese pilot's diary, recovered after the war, captured the arrogance perfectly. The Americans send children into the air, in planes that look like school desks with wings. They dive like stones. Surely they will all die before they touch us. That was the prevailing wisdom in the fleet. The enemy was weak. The enemy was clumsy. The enemy had no chance. But arrogance is the most expensive fuel in war. American naval commanders knew their chances were slim, yet they also knew desperation sharpens innovation. They leaned on the Dauntless not because it was the best plane on paper, but because it was the only tool that could reliably strike a moving target in the middle of the world's largest ocean. Its dive bombing method, mocked as crude, was in fact terrifyingly effective. The pilot would point his nose straight at the sea, plunging nearly vertically, holding the target in his sights until the very last moment before releasing his bomb. Imagine the Japanese perspective. Looking up at a tiny black speck, growing larger by the second, shrieking downward like a hawk. Anti-aircraft guns rattled, fighters scrambled, but the Dauntless kept coming. Slow, yes, but steady, like a guillotine blade. Here lay the irony. What the Japanese dismissed as obsolete turned out to be perfectly suited to the moment. Their carriers, burdened with aircraft refueling on deck, were tinderboxes. A single well-placed bomb could ignite fuel lines, detonate ordnance, and turn 1,000,000 tons of steel into a floating furnace. And the Dauntless, with its stone-like dive, could place that bomb with surgical precision. The problem, then, was not the machine itself but the mindset that judged it. Japan's commanders believed they were fighting an enemy already defeated. They failed to adapt, failed to respect the weapons arrayed against them, and failed to imagine that the sky could deliver disaster from something they considered beneath their notice. The United States, meanwhile, turned necessity into strategy. Pilots trained to embrace the Dauntless quirks. Mechanics pushed the aircraft to endure stress it was never designed for. And commanders gambled everything on the possibility that one good strike could outweigh 100 failures. Thus, the stage was set for Midway, a confrontation that would expose the difference between overconfidence and resilience. The Japanese entered the battle convinced they would draw the Americans into a trap. What they did not realize was that they had already built a trap for themselves, constructed not of clever strategy, but of arrogance. When the Dauntless appeared overhead, diving from the sky like a rain of judgment, Japan's admirals were not simply watching bombs fall. They were watching their own hubris explode before their eyes. The very plane they had laughed at became the executioner of their carrier fleet. That is the central problem of Midway, and perhaps of all wars, not the strength of your enemy's weapons, but your blindness to their danger. The Japanese Navy underestimated a tool they thought was clumsy, and by the time they realized its power, their empire was already burning. At its core, the Battle of Midway was not decided by sheer numbers, nor even by brilliant maneuvers. It hinged on a single technical reality. The underestimated SBD Dauntless was, paradoxically, the perfect weapon for striking carriers. While the Japanese prized elegance and speed, the Americans exploited ruggedness and precision. The clash between perception and function sealed the fate of the Rising Sun's fleet. The Dauntless was not designed to impress. Built by Douglas aircraft, its lines were stubby, almost awkward. Its top speed barely brushed 255 miles per hour, laughable compared to the sleek Zero, which could climb gracefully, dance through dogfights, and humiliate enemy fighters with ease. To Japanese engineers, the SBD looked like a farmer's cart parked beside a samurai stallion. But what the samurai sneered at, the farmer wielded with deadly efficiency. The genius of the Dauntless was not glamour, it was survivability. Its fuselage was reinforced, its controls stable even under the screaming stress of a vertical dive. While Japanese bombers like the Naval carried out shallow plunges, often scattering bombs with questionable accuracy, the SBD's pilots trained to point their noses almost straight down. Imagine a plane falling like a stone from 20,000 feet, the pilot enduring crushing G-forces, holding his target in the sight until the ocean filled his vision, then pulling up only seconds before impact. That, ironically, is what the Japanese called clumsy. Consider the mechanics of the dive itself. At 70 to 80 degrees, the Dauntless could maintain an unshakable line toward its target. The air brakes, large perforated flaps extending from its wings, stabilized the fall, preventing a fatal tumble. Japanese aircraft lacked such refinements. Their dives were shallower, their accuracy looser. A Naval bomber might hope to land a hit near a carrier's deck. The Dauntless, by contrast, could strike a smoking hole precisely into the heart of its target. Then there was the bomb. A single 1,000-pound explosive, delivered onto a flight deck crammed with fueled planes and armed ordnance, was not just destructive, it was apocalyptic. Japanese carriers, with their tightly packed hangars and inadequate damage control measures, were floating tinderboxes. American carriers, learning hard lessons from Pearl Harbor, had strengthened firefighting crews, reinforced bulkheads, and drilled their sailors endlessly. Japan, blinded by early success, still treated damage control as an afterthought. Thus, when a Dauntless bomb punched through their decks, fire spread like a plague, unstoppable and absolute. From a distance, Japanese commanders thought the Dauntless a clumsy anachronism. Up close, it was death descending at terminal velocity. Let us compare the numbers, not as sterile figures, but as pieces of the story. SBD Dauntless, top speed 255 mph, range 100 miles, bomb load up to 1,200 pounds. Aichi D3A Val, top speed 240 mph, range 915 miles, bomb load 550 pounds. Mitsubishi A6M0, top speed 331 mph, unmatched agility, but lightly armored and ill-suited to stopping a determined dive bomber. On paper, the Zero looked invincible. In practice, the Zero's light frame, built for agility, turned into a liability. Its bullets often bounced off the Dauntless' armored cockpit or self-sealing fuel tanks. Worse, the Zero had to climb into position to intercept, while the Dauntless plunged downward. The geometry of the fight favored the bomber, not the interceptor. By the time a Zero maneuvered into a firing lane, the Dauntless had already released its bomb and was clawing back toward the clouds. Here lies the irony. Japan's obsession with the Zero's elegance blinded them to the mundane realities of naval warfare. Winning dogfights was glorious, but sinking carriers required precision. The Dauntless was not the better duelist. It was the better assassin. And its pilots knew it. Veteran Ensign Dusty Kleiss later recalled that during training, you had to be ready to fly into hell itself. He wasn't exaggerating. Diving at near vertical angles, with tracer fire stitching the air around them, Dauntless crews often felt as though they were aiming not just their bombs, but their entire lives at the enemy fleet. Yet the machine, ugly as it was, gave them the control to make that aim count. The Japanese, by contrast, had mastered the art of appearances. Their carriers gleamed. Their aircraft shone like blades. Their admirals rehearsed elaborate maneuvers as though war were a kabuki performance. But beneath the spectacle lay brittle foundations, vulnerable hangars, fragile planes, and a doctrine that assumed the enemy would never strike first or strike effectively. The Dauntless turned those assumptions into firestorms. The secret of the Dauntless was not only its hardware but the doctrine behind it. American pilots trained relentlessly to master the terrifying dive. Many remembered their first attempt as a brush with death, the sudden plunge, the stomach lurch, the cockpit rattling like it would shake apart. Yet training hardened them. By Midway, Dauntless crews had rehearsed this suicidal ballet so often that it became instinct. They did not merely drop bombs. They performed surgical strikes at impossible angles. Contrast this with Japanese doctrine. Their dive bombers, the Val, executed gentler dives, easier on the nerves but less accurate. Their carriers could strike cities, ships, even battleships, but when it came to putting a single bomb squarely onto a small, moving target, their margin of error was far greater. The Dauntless' near-vertical descent gave it something the Japanese lacked: reliability. Then there was survivability. American designers understood that their pilots would face storms of anti-aircraft fire. So the Dauntless carried armor plating around the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural reinforcements to endure brutal punishment. Japanese engineers, obsessed with agility, stripped weight from their planes, leaving them fast but fragile. A Zero could turn on a dime but went up in flames with alarming ease. Against such fragility, the rugged Dauntless was ironically more durable than the predator sent to kill it. And then came the element of timing. At Midway, the Dauntless did not succeed because it was flawless. In fact, many squadrons were mauled, scattered, or annihilated before reaching their targets. Torpedo squadrons were butchered, drawing Japanese fighters down to sea level. But in that very chaos lay opportunity. When Dauntless groups finally found the Japanese carriers, the skies above were momentarily unguarded. Fate handed them a corridor, and training carried them through it. The result was catastrophic for Japan. Bombs ripped through flight decks stacked with armed aircraft. Chain reactions erupted, fuel lines ignited, munitions detonated, hangars became infernos. Japanese carriers lacked armored flight decks and efficient firefighting systems. Sailors fought bravely, but their ships were designed with offense in mind, not survival. By contrast, American carriers, scarred from Pearl Harbor, had drilled damage control into ritual. The difference was night and day. One navy had prepared to endure losses, the other assumed it would never suffer them. What if Japan had not underestimated the Dauntless? What if they had recognized its threat and adapted their doctrine? They might have invested in better air defense coordination, stationed combat air patrols higher, or reinforced their carrier decks. Perhaps the bombs of June 4th would still have fallen, but their fires might have been contained. History, however, does not reward hypotheticals. The Japanese chose to dismiss their enemy's weapon, and in doing so, guaranteed that its strike would be decisive. This irony is almost theatrical. The Japanese saw themselves as the masters of the Pacific, yet they were undone not by America's most advanced technology but by what they scorned as outdated. Their pride in the Zero blinded them to the Dauntless' utility. They expected elegance to triumph. Instead, brute precision did. In the end, the technical story of Midway is brutally simple. The Dauntless combined rugged design, dive-bombing accuracy, and desperate American doctrine into a weapon that could cripple carriers in a single strike. The Japanese Navy, blind in its arrogance, failed to adapt. 4 carriers, the beating heart of its offensive power, were lost in a single day. From that moment, Japan no longer dictated the war. The hunter had been caught by the prey it dismissed. The Dauntless was never glamorous. It lacked the sleek lines of the Zero, the menace of a torpedo bomber, or the mythic aura of a battleship. But in June 1942, it proved a simple truth. In war, danger often comes not from what you fear, but from what you ignore. The morning of June 3, 1942, the Pacific stretched empty and endless. Clouds drifted low, the sea breathing with slow, heavy swells. To Admiral Yamamoto, hidden hundreds of miles away aboard the battleship Yamato, this silence meant control. His plan was unfolding perfectly. Midway would be the bait, the Americans would rush blindly, and Japan's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would deliver the killing blow. But silence can deceive. Out there, above the waves, a lonely Catalina flying boat traced its slow arc. Its crew peered down through the morning haze and saw something extraordinary. The glint of steel, rows upon rows of Japanese transports, pushing toward Midway. A coded message crackled over the radio. Contact. The hunters had been seen. At Midway Atoll, that message struck like a hammer. Marines rolled barrels of fuel into pits, anti-aircraft crews clambered into their nests, mechanics cursed as they armed ancient wildcats and buffalo fighters. The atoll smelled of salt, cordite, and sweat. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew they were outclassed. Still, they waited. That afternoon, lumbering B-17s lifted from Midway's runways. Engines groaned, propellers biting humid air. Their mission, strike the Japanese fleet. From 20,000 feet, they dropped their bombs. The ocean below erupted in white splashes, beautiful, useless geysers. Japanese sailors laughed bitterly, calling it rain from clumsy gods. To them, the Americans were amateurs. June 4th arrived with a sky painted gold. On the decks of the Japanese carriers, flight crews moved with machine-like rhythm. At 4:30 a.m., aircraft engines roared to life. Waves slapped against steel hulls as 108 planes surged into the dawn, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and the sleek Zeros that had humiliated every opponent since Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nagumo, calm and assured, believed this strike would silence Midway's defenses and set the stage for America's funeral. At 6:20 a.m., bombs rained on the atoll. The earth trembled. Runways cracked. Fuel tanks ignited into fireballs that rolled black smoke into the sky. Inside bunkers, Marines coughed through the acrid haze, firing back with flak guns that painted the air with black puffs. To the Japanese pilots circling above, the scene looked convincing. Midway was burning. They wheeled away, radios crackling victory. But their reports carried a sting. Midway was damaged, not destroyed. The airfields still functioned. Another strike might be necessary. Nagumo frowned. His returning planes would soon need to land and refuel. But should he arm the next wave with bombs for another atoll strike, or torpedoes to attack ships, if American carriers appeared? He hesitated. He changed orders. Bombs came off, torpedoes went on, then bombs again. On his 4 great carriers, crews sweated over live explosives and open fuel lines. The decks, usually so disciplined, became cluttered with chaos. Floating fortresses turned, unknowingly, into floating powder kegs. Meanwhile, Midway refused to die quietly. At 7 a.m., Marine fighters clawed into the sky. Obsolete Brewster Buffaloes wobbled like school buses with wings. They met the Zeros head-on and were shredded. One by one, they burst into fire, spiraling into the sea. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. Every minute they drew the Zeros down was a minute Japan's fleet was blind above. Between 7:10 and 7:30, Midway's bombers made their run. Vindicators, B-26 Marauders, even more B-17s. They attacked low, high, from every angle. Anti-aircraft guns thundered, Zeros slashed through them. Torpedoes skidded harmlessly, bombs missed wide. Smoke trails marked their deaths across the sky. From the decks of Akagi and Kaga, officers sneered. To them, these attacks proved what they already believed. American planes were relics, their pilots amateurs. But arrogance is a slow poison. In sneering, they missed the truth. Each wave, though tactically useless, forced Nagumo to wait longer. His decks stayed jammed with planes half-fueled, bombs half-loaded. Each delay stretched the tension tighter. At 8:20 a.m., a scout plane's delayed message finally arrived. Enemy ships sighted. American carriers. East of Midway. They were not retreating. They were waiting. The illusion shattered. The Americans had not walked into a trap, they had set their own. And still, Nagumo believed his superiority unshakable. His Zeros would protect him. His carriers could adjust. And those clumsy, dauntless dive bombers the Americans relied on? Laughable. He did not know that within the hour, those very falling bricks would plunge from the sky and turn his fleet into funeral pyres. The clock struck 8:30 a.m., June 4, 1942. On the Japanese carriers, the mood was tense but not panicked. Officers barked orders across decks cluttered with fuel hoses and bombs. Below, ordnance crews cursed as they swapped torpedoes for bombs, then bombs for torpedoes again, obedient to Nagumo's shifting commands. Every second wasted was another spark in a room already filled with gasoline fumes. Far above, American eyes scanned the horizon. Squadrons of TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, slow, ungainly relics, lumbered toward the Japanese fleet. Pilots gripped their throttles, knowing the odds. They were flying coffins. At 9:20 a.m., the first torpedo squadron made its run. They flew low, steady, straight into the storm. Zeros pounced. Japanese fighters cut through the Devastators with almost cruel ease, cannon fire ripping wings apart. Torpedoes splashed uselessly into the sea. Out of an entire squadron, barely a handful survived. To Nagumo's officers, the scene was exhilarating. American bravery was admirable, but bravery without results was suicide. Once more, they laughed at the futility of their enemies' weapons. But again, that laughter blinded them. Every Zero dragged low to slaughter torpedo bombers was a Zero not circling high to guard against the unseen. At 10 a.m., the horizon shimmered. From the northeast, a formation of SBD Dauntless dive bombers emerged, guided by instinct, luck, and desperate navigation. Their fuel gauges dipped dangerously. Many had wandered for hours, searching the empty ocean. Then, almost by accident, they stumbled upon the Japanese fleet spread wide below them. The timing was eerie, almost theatrical. At that exact moment, Nagumo's carriers were at their most vulnerable. Their decks bristled with fueled aircraft waiting to launch. Bombs lay exposed, stacked like dominoes of destruction. Fuel hoses snaked across wooden planks slick with aviation gasoline. It was the very definition of a powder keg, and overhead, the match was falling. The dauntless pilots tightened their grips. Cockpits rattled as they banked into the dive. Through their sights, The Japanese carriers swelled like targets painted by fate itself. The sun glared on steel, waves foamed white against dark hulls. Then came the scream. Imagine the sound, the shriek of air brakes cutting through the roar of engines, metal vibrating like it might tear itself apart. The Dauntless fell at near vertical angles, shadows streaking across the sea. Japanese sailors craned their necks upward, momentarily frozen. Then panic erupted. Anti-aircraft guns belched fire. Sirens wailed. Zeros scrambled, too low, too late. At 10:22 a.m., the first bomb struck. One Dauntless peeled onto the Kaga. The bomb punched through her flight deck, detonating among parked aircraft. A second, a third, followed, igniting gasoline, munitions, and men alike. Within minutes, Kaga was an inferno. The Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, met the same fate. A single bomb found her deck. One was enough. Fire raced through her hangars, consuming her heart. Nagumo, stunned, had to abandon ship before noon. Nearby, Soryu burned as well. Bombs tore open her bowels, leaving her crew no chance. The Dauntless, once mocked as clumsy, had just executed one of the deadliest minutes in naval history. From the perspective of the Japanese sailors, it must have felt like betrayal by the gods. Their Zeros were the best in the world. Their admirals had promised invincibility. Yet here, in broad daylight, their carriers burned from bombs dropped by the very plane they dismissed as obsolete. The sky reeked of burning fuel and cordite. Men leapt into the sea, their uniforms aflame. Officers screamed orders that dissolved into chaos. Within 5 minutes, the heart of Japan's carrier strike force had been gutted. It was a turning point delivered not by battleships or grand maneuvers, but by young men in rugged aircraft, diving like stones from heaven. The falling bricks had shattered an empire's illusion. And yet, the battle was not over. One carrier, Hiryu, still lived. Its decks roared with aircraft preparing to avenge their fallen sisters. For the moment, Japan clung to the hope that one blade remained sharp enough to cut back. But fate had already turned. By late morning on June 4th, the proud illusion of invincibility had gone up in smoke. 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, were gutted, their decks torn open like butchered beasts. Columns of black smoke spiraled into the sky, visible for miles, as though the ocean itself was mocking Japan's pride. And yet, the Japanese still clung to hope. Hiryu, the last surviving carrier, had escaped the opening blow. Her decks seethed with activity. Pilots strapped themselves into cockpits, mechanics shouted over the roar of engines, officers pointed furiously toward the east. There, somewhere beyond the haze, American carriers were waiting. The rising sun would not fall without swinging its sword one last time. At noon, Hiryu's strike group launched. Torpedo bombers skimmed the waves, dive bombers soared high. Their target, USS Yorktown. The Yorktown was already a wounded veteran, patched together in mere days after Coral Sea. Her decks still bore scars, paint still smelled fresh where welders had worked miracles. To the Japanese, she must have seemed like a ripe kill. At 12:20 p.m., bombs fell. Explosions thundered across Yorktown's deck. Fires roared, bulkheads crumpled. Smoke poured from her sides. Crews fought desperately, dousing flames, dragging wounded men to safety. For a moment, it looked as if Yorktown would share the fate of her Japanese counterparts. And here comes the cruel irony. Even in agony, the American carrier refused to die quickly. Firefighting crews, drilled endlessly since Pearl Harbor, contained the infernos. Damage control teams sealed bulkheads, pumped out water, patched holes with anything they could grab. The Yorktown, bleeding but alive, steadied herself. To the Japanese, who had never bothered to train their sailors in systematic damage control, this resilience was unthinkable. They had built war machines meant to shine in victory, not endure defeat. But Hiryu's second strike came swiftly. Torpedo planes knifed low, weaving through anti-aircraft fire. At 2:40 p.m., torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's hull. The great ship shuddered, tilted, and finally went dead in the water. Her crew abandoned ship, leaping into the oily sea. The Japanese cheered. At last, a measure of revenge. Their cheers were premature. Yorktown was crippled, yes, but not gone, and the price for her sacrifice was about to come due. Because even as Hiryu's planes returned triumphant, the Dauntless were already on the hunt again. Fuel low, nerves frayed, they pushed west, guided by fragments of radio chatter and instinct sharpened by desperation. And just as fate had delivered them to Nagumo's fleet that morning, it now delivered them to Hiryu. At 5 p.m., the Dauntless appeared overhead. Japanese sailors, already exhausted, looked up and saw the hated silhouette again, that squat, clumsy dive bomber they had ridiculed as obsolete. The flying anvil, the falling brick, the airplane they said would never touch them. And then it screamed. The dive began, engines howling, air brakes tearing the sky with their shriek. Bombs whistled down. One smashed into Hiryu's deck, exploding among armed planes. Fire blossomed instantly, licking across the carrier's length. Another bomb followed, then another. Within minutes, flames devoured her. So ended the last blade of the rising sun's strike force. The ship that had promised vengeance now joined her sisters in ruin. By dusk, Hiryu was a funeral pyre drifting alone, her crew throwing themselves into the sea as the Empire's dream collapsed with her. The irony was merciless. 4 Japanese carriers, symbols of technological pride and strategic genius, destroyed not by mighty battleships or secret weapons, but by the very dive bomber they had mocked as second-rate. The Zero, their divine fighter, had danced circles around American planes for months. But what good was a perfect dance if the stage beneath you was burning? This was the bitter lesson. Japan had gambled everything on speed, elegance, and early victories. They believed war was a kabuki performance where beauty and precision guaranteed triumph. America, clumsy and desperate, embraced ugliness and pragmatism. The Dauntless was proof. It did not look like a weapon of destiny. It looked like a tool. But in the Pacific, tools won wars while trophies burned. As the sun set on June 4th, black smoke still curled into the heavens. The sea was littered with wreckage, lifeboats, and oil slicks. Somewhere among it all, Japanese survivors clung to debris, staring at the sky where the Dauntless had come from. Perhaps, in that moment, they realized the cosmic joke. The Empire's fleet had been humbled by the airplane they once dismissed with a laugh. And the laugh now echoed back as fire. Night fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, with 4 Japanese carriers burning like funeral pyres against the dark horizon. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, once the sharpest edge of Japan's blade, were now drifting coffins. The rising sun had not just set, it had been doused in smoke and oil. But the battle was not finished. The Americans, too, had paid a heavy price. Yorktown, though valiantly saved after the first strikes, lay crippled. Her crew, exhausted and heartsick, had abandoned ship. In the eerie silence that followed, she floated like a ghost, scarred, smoking, but somehow refusing to sink. Damage control parties even returned, stubbornly patching wounds, as if the ship herself demanded to keep fighting. For a brief moment, hope flickered that Yorktown might limp back to Pearl Harbor once again. But fate was not done testing her. On June 6th, Japanese submarines prowling the waters found their chance. Torpedoes streaked through the sea and slammed into her side. This time, no drills or patches could hold back the flood. Slowly, with dignity, Yorktown rolled onto her beam and slipped beneath the waves. She had absorbed the fury of 2 carrier strikes and a submarine ambush before surrendering. Her death was not a defeat, it was a shield. Every bomb and torpedo she took spared her sisters, Enterprise and Hornet, to fight another day. For Japan, the loss was irrecoverable. 4 carriers gone in a single battle meant not just ships, but irreplaceable pilots, deck crews, and officers. These were the veterans of Pearl Harbor, the elite of the elite. No factory, no training program, could conjure them back. The Empire had thrown its best dice and watched them scatter across the ocean floor. And all of it, this catastrophe, was delivered by the Dauntless. That flying anvil, that obsolete dive bomber, the Japanese laughed at, had done in 5 minutes what battleships dreamed of for decades. 4 mighty carriers, undone by the very thing Japan dismissed as beneath notice. It was not just defeat, it was humiliation. Imagine the aftertaste for Japan's naval high command. They had boasted that their Zeros ruled the skies. They had treated America's Navy as a crippled dog. They had equated elegance with superiority. Yet they were undone by clunky workhorses falling from the clouds like bricks. War has a cruel sense of irony, and Midway delivered it in full measure. In Tokyo, the official bulletins softened the truth. They spoke of setbacks, of temporary reverses. But behind closed doors, the Admiralty knew the truth. The Empire's expansion had ended. Never again would Japan launch a grand offensive across the Pacific. From this moment, it would stagger backward, losing piece by piece, until the rising sun collapsed entirely. For the Americans, Midway was more than a victory. It was vindication. At Pearl Harbor, they had been humiliated, their fleet wrecked, their pride shattered. But here, at Midway, they had turned the tables, not with greater numbers or glamorous machines, but with grit, calculation, and a dive bomber no one respected until it proved unstoppable. And that is perhaps the most cutting joke of all. Japan had mastered the art of spectacle, shining carriers, graceful fighters, precise maneuvers. But war does not reward spectacle. It rewards the weapon that gets the job done. The Dauntless was not beautiful. It was not fast. It was not feared. Until it was. So the ocean wrote its verdict: arrogance sinks faster than steel. By the time the smoke cleared, the Pacific belonged not to the rising sun, but to the falling bricks that had become angels of fire. The Dauntless did not just destroy ships, it destroyed illusions. And in the end, illusions are the heaviest cargo any fleet can carry. Midway was not simply the clash of 2 navies, it was the clash of 2 mindsets. On one side, Japan worshipped elegance, speed, and perfection. On the other, America embraced rugged tools, ugly compromises, and the stubborn refusal to quit. The irony is delicious. Japan's obsession with beauty made them fragile, while America's acceptance of ugliness made them deadly. Let us compare the machines themselves. The Japanese Zero, swift and graceful, was the envy of 1941. It could outturn anything in the sky. Pilots spoke of it with reverence, as if it were a divine sword forged by the gods. But like many divine swords in legend, it was brittle. Its designers had shaved off armor to keep it light, stripped self-sealing fuel tanks to extend its range. The result? A fighter that burned like tissue paper when hit. A perfect dancer, but a fragile one, useless when the ballroom was on fire. Now look at the SBD Dauntless. Slow, bulky, about as glamorous as a tractor. No pilot bragged about flying one at cocktail parties. And yet, it had what the Zero lacked: armor that saved lives, fuel tanks that didn't explode at the first spark, air brakes that made its dive terrifyingly stable. In other words, the Dauntless was ugly but practical, like a toolbox that doesn't look impressive until it's the only thing standing between you and disaster. Japan's bombers, too, suffered from the same disease of elegance. The Naval dive bomber could glide gracefully, yes, but its shallow dives scattered bombs across wide areas. The Kate torpedo plane carried powerful weapons, but was slow and exposed. And Japanese doctrine assumed these weaknesses didn't matter, because the enemy would always be too slow, too clumsy, too cowardly to resist. At Pearl Harbor, that arrogance seemed justified. At Midway, it was suicidal. America's doctrine, by contrast, was forged in humiliation. At Pearl Harbor, they had learned the hard way that ships without air cover were helpless. They had watched battleships burn. They had buried sailors by the thousands. So when Midway came, they did not care if their planes looked ridiculous. They cared if they could put a bomb on a carrier's deck. The Dauntless could. That was enough. The contrast in damage control reveals the same arrogance. Japanese ships were floating palaces, efficient at launching strikes, spectacular in appearance, but fragile inside. Firefighting drills were rare, bulkheads weak, hangars cramped with munitions and fuel. The assumption was simple: why prepare to survive a hit when you are too perfect to be hit? America, humbled at Pearl Harbor, trained damage control as a religion. Sailors became firefighters, welders, and miracle workers. That is why Yorktown absorbed 2 full-scale assaults and still floated long enough to draw enemy fire. Japan built ships for parades. America built ships for punishment. The strategic mindset followed the same tragic comedy. Yamamoto envisioned Midway as a flawless trap. He spread his forces wide, confident in secrecy. But secrecy meant nothing once codes were cracked. He believed Americans were broken in spirit, that they would react slowly, clumsily. Instead, they waited with carriers hidden, like wolves around a campfire. Japan planned as though war was theater, every move rehearsed. America treated war as a street brawl, messy, ugly, but survivable. And in a street fight, the toolbox wins over the katana. Perhaps the sharpest irony is this: Japan called the Dauntless obsolete, a relic. Yet it was precisely its age that made it reliable. It had been tested, refined, and hardened in service. Its flaws were known, its strengths understood. Meanwhile, Japan gambled everything on the Zero, a weapon so specialized that one good punch shattered it. The Americans brought a hammer. The Japanese brought a glass sword. Guess which one survived? So the grand lesson is almost comedic. In war, underestimation kills. The Japanese laughed at falling bricks, until those bricks fell straight through their carrier decks. They believed beauty equaled strength until beauty went up in flames. They trusted perfection until imperfection outlasted them. Midway was not just a battle, it was a punchline written in fire. And the Empire, once convinced it was invincible, learned that arrogance sinks faster than steel. The smoke of Midway did not simply drift away, it clung to the Empire of Japan like a curse. In one day, 4 carriers had vanished. But the true wound went deeper. Japan had lost the irreplaceable core of its naval air power. Pilots, deck crews, maintenance experts, men who had honed their skills in years of combat, were gone. Machines can be rebuilt, experience cannot. Tokyo's newspapers tried to soften the blow. They called Midway a temporary setback, as though 4 smoking hulks on the ocean floor were minor inconveniences, like a train delayed by rain. But in private, Japan's admirals knew the truth. They had gambled their best, and their best had been buried beneath the Pacific. The long-term consequences unfolded swiftly. From that June onward, Japan never again seized the strategic initiative. The empire, once expanding like fire through dry grass, began to shrink. Guadalcanal followed, then the Solomons, then the Marianas. Each step backward drained resources and morale. And always overhead, American planes, ugly, plentiful, relentless, hammered them. What made this decline all the more bitter was its absurd cause. Japan had not been undone by some revolutionary secret weapon. It was not nuclear fire, nor radar sorcery, nor massive battleships that sank their carriers. It was the Dauntless, the flying anvil they had mocked. Imagine the sting, the elite warriors of the rising sun, destroyed by what they had dismissed as junk. Pride is heavy, and at Midway, it dragged the empire to the bottom faster than any torpedo. America, by contrast, feasted on the victory. Midway transformed the Navy's morale. In December 1941, they were the humiliated underdog, their battleships smoking wrecks at Pearl Harbor. By June 1942, they had slain giants. The Dauntless became a symbol, not glamorous, but reliable, like the nation itself. Newspapers hailed the dive bombers as heroes with wings. Pilots who had once been considered expendable were suddenly the spearhead of a resurgent fleet. Strategically, Midway flipped the Pacific War on its axis. Japan's plan for expansion was dead. No longer could it project power across oceans with impunity. Every battle afterward was defensive, desperate, and costly. The United States, meanwhile, built carriers faster than Japan could sink them, trained pilots by the thousands, and turned the Pacific into a conveyor belt of steel and fire. The empire had planned for a short war, a lightning conquest. Midway sentenced it to a long war, one it could never win. And what of doctrine? Midway taught 2 brutal lessons. For the Americans, Never again underestimate your own ugly weapons. For the Japanese, never again assume beauty makes you invincible. Sadly, Tokyo's admirals clung to denial. Even after Midway, they continued to worship the Zero, continued to neglect damage control, continued to pretend that discipline alone could replace industrial might. It was as if they had learned nothing, as if the smoldering wrecks of 4 carriers were not a lesson, but an inconvenience to be ignored. This blindness carried through the war. At the Philippine Sea in 1944, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan lost hundreds of aircraft to a wall of American Hellcats and flak. By then, their pilots were green, their carriers empty shells. The arrogance that began at Midway ended there in humiliation. Meanwhile, the Dauntless quietly retired, replaced by newer dive bombers like the SB-2C Helldiver. Yet its legacy endured. Historians still point out the cruel symmetry. A plane designed in the 1930s, outdated by 1942, had nevertheless delivered the most decisive carrier kills in naval history. The Japanese had called it clumsy, but the ocean remembers it as the scalpel that changed the war. Even today, Midway stands as a monument to irony. Japan believed it could dictate the course of history with elegance and speed. Instead, it was undone by stubborn pragmatism. The Dauntless had no sleek lines, no mystique, no aura of invincibility. But it had what mattered: precision, durability, and timing. That was enough to turn empires. And so the aftermath of Midway rippled across the world. In Washington, confidence surged, factories redoubled their efforts. In Tokyo, doubt gnawed at the Admiralty, though pride kept them from admitting it. To every Japanese officer who once sneered at the Dauntless, the war from 1942 onward must have felt like one long, bitter punchline. Because what sank the fleet at Midway was not just bombs. It was arrogance, dressed in white uniforms and polished steel, laughing at an enemy they thought too clumsy to matter. The laugh still echoes today, in history books, in documentaries, in every retelling of June 1942. The rising sun mocked the falling brick. The falling brick crushed the rising sun. Midway was not just a battle, it was a revelation carved into steel and fire. The Japanese Navy entered the fight convinced of its invulnerability, armed with sleek machines and elegant doctrine. They left with their pride shattered, their carriers aflame, their dreams sinking beneath the waves. The Americans, in contrast, walked into Midway with doubt, patched ships, and aircraft mocked as antiques. Yet it was precisely those antiques that rewrote the course of the Pacific. The SBD Dauntless, the unglamorous dive bomber dismissed as a brick with wings, became the executioner of empires. There is no poetry more cutting than that. What lesson emerges? That arrogance is the deadliest enemy. Japan did not lose because its pilots lacked courage. They fought with ferocity. It did not lose because its ships were poorly built. They were marvels of engineering. Japan lost because it believed it could not lose. It trusted appearance over resilience, elegance over pragmatism, spectacle over survival. And war, indifferent as ever, exposed the folly. The Dauntless stands today as proof that victory belongs not to the most beautiful weapon, but to the one that does its job when history demands it. It was slow, clumsy, even ridiculed. Yet when the moment came, it dove with precision, struck with power, and changed the world. That is the essence of war. The underestimated tool can become the instrument of destiny. And for us, the echo is clear. In every age, arrogance whispers that we are too strong, too advanced, too clever to fail. Midway reminds us that no empire, no technology, no doctrine is safe from the unexpected. The danger you laugh at today may be the blade at your throat tomorrow. Now, as you close your eyes and picture the Pacific on that June morning, the screaming dives, the flames, the black columns of smoke, I want you to carry this irony with you. Japan laughed at the Dauntless. History laughs at Japan. If you found yourself pulled into this story, if you felt the roar of engines, the crash of bombs, the bitter taste of pride swallowed by fire, then stay with us. This channel is where we dive deeper into the hidden moments of history, where overlooked machines and underestimated men reveal the turning points that textbooks barely touch. Subscribe, join the crew, and fly with us into the stories that changed the world. Because Midway was not just the day the rising sun was dimmed. It was the day an obsolete dive bomber proved that the underestimated often shape destiny. And if you think history is only written by the glamorous, then you've missed the point. The Dauntless wrote history one dive at a time, and it did so while the world was laughing.